Hello, Year 8, and welcome to your first lesson looking at the topic of Nazi Germany and what life was like in Nazi Germany is what we'll be looking at today. Before we begin, just a few things. First of all, you need to make sure you've got the worksheet open in front of you from Google Classrooms. That's the one that should look a bit like the image below with the grids. You'll be filling this in as we go along in today's lesson. I'm going to be going over some slides of information, and at the end of each of the slides, I'm going to need you just to pause the video and just to fill in the slide, and that should become clear as we're going along. So at the end of each slide, just pause it, fill in the gaps, and then continue. Now that submitted worksheet will need to go back to your teacher by Sunday the 26th of April, so we can just check to make sure you've understood everything, you've completed the work, and see if there's any issues, any misconceptions at all. And along the way, if there's any questions, please email your teacher if there's anything that you're not sure about at all. Before we move on, just a few things then. So this topic looks at Nazi Germany from 1933 to 1939. And that means I just want to be clear here that there's no Holocaust yet. You will be looking at that in Year 9. Jews and other undesirable people in Germany, people the Nazis don't like gypsies and alcoholics, they are treated horrifically during this time. That's true. But there's no systematic killing in death camps yet. That will come in the 1940s. So we don't look at that in this topic. We do look at the Jews being treated badly, but we don't look at the systematic killing. There is a difference there. So, like I said, your first task is quite a big one. I'm going to give you several slides of information about life in Nazi Germany. There'll be 12 in total. At the end of each slide, I'll need you to pause the video and update the grids that you can see, thinking about how this change would have impacted people in Nazi Germany, both positively or negatively. And just a tip before we begin, have a think about this, because some of the changes might have a positive impact on one group, but a negative impact on another. So keep your eye out for that as we go along. Needless to say, this isn't all the changes the Nazis made in Germany. We'll be looking at different groups in a bit more detail as we go along. These are just 12 I found interesting as a starting point to introduce you to the topic. Okay, so group number one, or point number one I should say, looking at farmers. Now, when Hitler took power in Nazi Germany, he realised how important farmers were. He realised he needed farmers to produce food for his growing empire. And therefore he said to farmers, when I'm in charge, your debts, which you're worried about, the amount of money you owe people, I'm going to get rid of that. Your debts will be gone. And also, I'm going to increase the price of farm produce that people buy, things like meat, milk, and cheese, for example. And by 1937, that increased by 20%. People were paying more for farm produce. And this meant that the farmers made a lot more money as a result. So, pause the video there and just have a think about that then, please. What would that look like on your grids? Okay. So hopefully you've typed in something like this. Let's have a look at a model answer for this so we can make sure we're doing the work properly. So we can see there in our farmers, clearly these are positive things for the farmers. So I've just made a note in that grid. I've not copied and pasted the whole box. I've just summed it up in my own words so I know that I understand it. I've just put down there in the positive side of things, farmers received more money as their debts were cancelled and the price of farm produce increased. So that's the sort of thing we're looking for as we go along. That's box 1 out of 12. Let's move on. Okay, point number 2. The Nazis wanted a stronger army, and they recruited 1.4 million unemployed men into the military pretty much straight away. And this was ignoring the Treaty of Versailles that you've looked at before, where after the end of World War I, the Allies said, Germany, you cannot have a strong army. Your army is reduced to being about 100,000 men. And Hitler came along and basically said, nope, I'm ignoring that straight away. And I'm going to, from my 6 million unemployed people in Germany in 1933, I'm going to put 1.4 million of those into the army straight away. Okay, moving on. Number 3. Now, looking at the role of women, and we'll look at this in more detail in another lesson, but Hitler and the Nazis basically said, look, women, you are just as important as men, but you're important in a different way. And your role is believed to be at home, being a housewife, being a mother, whilst the man goes off to work, goes off to war. Very traditional, stereotypical role. And so this meant that women were actually actively encouraged to leave their jobs, especially if they were high-paid jobs, things like lawyer, teacher, doctor. And then Hitler could say to the unemployed men, come into these positions. This will help solve the unemployment problem. Now, this might seem like a lot of women would have hated the Nazis as a result. But what's interesting is that Hitler had always said he would do this. But in 1932, Hitler said, I will have 800,000 women leave the posts if I become leader. But 1933, half of his voters were women. So there were some women who hated this, but there were some who said, no, I am prepared to be a housewife. I am prepared to be a mother as a result. Okay, point 4. The Nazis looked at the workplace as well. They wanted people to work hard. And so one thing that was set up was something called the Beauty of Labour Organisation. And the aim was to make people see that working hard to make Germany strong again was a good thing. And so the Nazis were very keen to make sure that managers improved working conditions in places like factories. And that would include changes like hot meals being provided for workers, better ventilation, with things like more windows in factories, better lighting, and even basic things like washing facilities. Now, this sounds like this would have been a really positive change for the workers, and it did improve the workplace. But there's one thing we need to make clear here, and that's it's the workers that have to do this. The workers have to do things like build the sinks in. The workers have to do things like build in new windows and so on. And this was done at the workers' expense. They were told, okay, build it. And this was basically overtime for the workers, but they were not paid for this labour. So whilst it was brought in, it was the workers who had to build those objects, build those items themselves to improve the workplace. Point number 5. The Nazis realised they still had a large amount of unemployed people. And so they said, okay, we are going to put you on what we call job schemes. And so this meant that the unemployed people would get to work building structures for Germany, things like schools and hospitals, and building things like the new motorway, or Autobahn as it's called in Germany. And building the motorway alone created jobs for 80,000 men. Again, be clear here, it wasn't women who were accepted on these job schemes, 80,000 men. Speaking of the job schemes, the Nazis changed the unemployment system that had been in Germany before. So before, if you didn't have a job, you just had to show you were looking for work, and the state or the government would give you a bit of money to keep you going. They'd give you benefits so you could survive. The Nazis came along and the Nazis changed that completely. Because the Nazis said, we aren't paying you benefits if you don't have a job. This is what we're going to do instead. If you don't have a job, you have to sign up for our work scheme. You have to start getting involved, actively making these structures like hospitals and the motorways. Now, some people are reluctant to do heavy manual work like that for various reasons, whether it was medical conditions, whether they just didn't fancy it. And if you refused, you weren't paid, you weren't given benefits at all. So what if you did step up, and what if you did say, okay, I'll get involved in doing this heavy labour? Well, you weren't paid by the state, but actually you were paid less than you had been before when you were not employed and just given benefits. So just think about that for a second. You were paid more when you were just saying you were looking for work, and the state would give you benefits, then when the Nazis took charge and you had to do physical hard work, building hospitals, building motorways, and the state paid you less than you had been given before. Okay, box 7. Let's go back to the farmers again. And although there were benefits for the farmers, as we saw with point 1, I want to be clear here that the farmers' work was strictly controlled by the Nazis. There was a lot of sort of busybodying going on here, and farmers, although they appreciated the extra pay, they didn't like the measurements that were taken in place. Let's look at one extreme example, which is where farmers were expected to keep written records of their creatures they kept, things like their hens, for example. And farmers were meant to keep a track of the produce that the hens were producing with the eggs. And the Nazis basically said, look, it's survival of the fittest. If you've got a hen that is not laying at least 65 eggs in a year, it's not worth keeping, it's not worth feeding, it should be slaughtered. Now you can imagine if you're a farmer, you're a busy person, the last thing you've got time to do is to keep a little notebook and a checklist of exactly what each hen is up to. And yet the Nazis would still expect to see these written records if they paid visits to farms. Okay, box 8. Well, we've seen that the Nazis now were looking to have a bigger army to protect Germany. Now, if you're having a big army, you've got to make sure that army is well protected and equipped. And so in order to do this, they bought a lot of army materials from manufacturers. They realised they would need more things like uniforms, vehicles, weapons, and other equipment from manufacturers. But I want you to think about this. I'm not going to give the answer away here. This clearly benefits the manufacturers. But if you have got a manufacturer who needs to make more goods, what do they need to do this? Okay, the picture of the tanks might help a little bit there. Think about that. If you need to make more things, you need more what to make sure that this happens. There's more than one box that we can make notes in here. Have a think. Okay, box 9. So let's move on to talk about children. And again, we'll talk about this in depth in another lesson. But children were brainwashed, or a better word is indoctrinated. And boys were made to practice things like military drill in school. Their boys basically were told to focus on the army. And that was done in classwork as well, things like maths lessons, how many bombs would you need to destroy a city. And this military drill didn't just end in school, but also in youth clubs, things called like the Hitler Youth, for example, after school, where you would go for several hours most days. And this meant from a young age, most boys were prepared for war, and they took this as a career and just went straight into the army because they had been indoctrinated this way from a young age. So in places like the Hitler Youth, boys were told about the importance of them going off to work and provide for the family, why it was important that they found a pure German and married and had pure German children, why it was important that women would stay at home because that was their role, why Jews were seen as dangerous and why Jews were the enemy that needs to be removed from Germany. And of course, children from a young age believe most things that adults tell them. They assume that it's true. And so many children from a young age believe this anti-Jewish propaganda. And a better term for anti-Jewish is anti-Semitism. It's a bit of better terminology there. Nearly done. 3 more. Number 10. Let's go back to the workplace again. And trade unions were removed from the workplace. Now, when I say trade union, that basically means a group that looks after workers' rights, to make sure that workers aren't taken advantage of in the workplace, to make sure that they're not working too hard, or to make sure that their pay is fair. And most workplaces today will have a trade union that a worker can go to if there's any issues. Doesn't matter if you work in a factory, a supermarket, a school, there are workers' rights in place. Well, Hitler wanted complete control of Germany. Hitler didn't want to have to deal with trade unions, so he got rid of them. He said, actually, I'm in charge of the factories, I'm in charge of workers' rights, trade unions aren't needed anymore. And so this meant that the workers in the factories couldn't complain about poor working conditions. They couldn't go on strike and stop working to defend their rights. And if they did, Hitler would say, well, I'm going to arrest you then. I'm going to have my police arrest you. You're not doing as I've said. And this meant that the workers lost their right to have the say about improving their jobs, improving their working conditions, improving their pay. And you must remember, some of these factories were still very unsafe at the time. Okay. Now, with the factories, without trade unions being there, Hitler could make any changes he wanted. So, for example, he increased the hours for workers in factories by 15%. But he didn't increase their pay, he still kept their pay low. And that meant that German workers in factories were doing more work for the same money. Now, you might think, so what? But let's use a comparison in your school day. Imagine if I told you that you weren't leaving school at 3:10, you were leaving school at 4 o'clock. You were doing longer in school, but actually your grades would stay the same. It wouldn't make a difference if you'd left at 3:10 or 4 o'clock, your grades are still the same. And you start to see a comparison here, what it was like with these people in the factories. They were told to work longer for the same pay, just like you would be told to be staying in school for longer and still receive the same grades as you would have done if you'd left at 3:10. You start to see why these people in the factories might have been so aggrieved towards this and so angry. And my last point is that, we'll come on to this later on, this is a big point with Nazi Germany, and that is the Nazis blamed the Jews for all of Germany's problems. And they told the German people not to use Jewish shops anymore. They would organise things like boycotts, like you can see in a picture in black and white there, where a Nazi officer would stand outside a shop and forbid people from going in. Now, that only had to happen for one day for people to be too scared to go into the shop at all. You can imagine what would happen to Jewish businesses if people were not coming into the shops to buy their produce. The Nazis took it further. The Nazis would actually confiscate businesses. They would take them away from Jewish people and they would give them to unemployed Germans. And this helped the Nazis to deal with the unemployment problem again, because they just took jobs away from the Jews and tried to force them out of Germany. And you can see there in the picture in colour that propaganda was used to humiliate the Jews, to make them seem like monsters, to make them seem like the enemy. And a lot of people believed this propaganda in Germany at the time. Okay, so I'd like to move on to task 2 now. You should have a grid that's been completed in with ideas from those slides. If you look at task 2, you've looked at 5 groups. I'd like you to place the 5 groups in order now, from the group that benefited the most from the Nazis taking control of Germany at the top at number 1, all the way down to the bottom to the group that benefited the least from Nazi Germany. When you're done, press play again to continue. And your final task, task 3. Could you please now write a paragraph to explain which group you selected as benefiting the most from Nazi control, and also the group you believe benefited the least. So to make your answer even stronger, so we're not just writing a sentence here, because I'm looking for a paragraph of the information that you've picked up from this lesson, think about why you did not pick other groups as well. Think about why they didn't come into it. I've given you a structure, but you don't have to follow this. Tell me why, for example, you picked one group as first and why you felt it benefited more than the group in second. Tell me why you put a group in fifth and why you felt life was worse for them than the group that you placed in fourth. This is just a structure I've given you on the worksheet. If you'd rather write it in your own style, absolutely go for it. But I'm looking for a full developed answer here with your own thoughts. I'm not just looking for a few lines. When you're done, press play to finish the lesson. Okay, and that's it for this lesson today. Thank you very much for taking part. Thank you for submitting the work. Just a reminder, can you please make sure that you have submitted the completed worksheet to your teacher in Google Classrooms by Sunday the 26th of April at 5 p.m, so that we can check your work and make sure there's no misunderstandings at all. And if there's any feedback on this lesson you'd like to give to me personally, there's my email there, gbrown@stopsleyhighschool.co.uk. Now you've completed the work, please make sure you're looking after yourself. If you can, go out in the garden, get some fresh air. If you're able to, go for a walk. Most important thing is, guys, is that you stay safe, look after yourselves, and take care. Thank you very much.